Hi everyone, welcome back. So we are talking about the readings for week 9 and we're going to be looking at setting. The first story we're looking at is The Gilded Six Bits by Zora Neale Hurston. It has a setting that's really intimately connected to the plot and the characters. The setting is almost like a character in and of itself. Then we're going to be looking at Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. This is a story you may have read before, but I wanted to present it here just so you can kind of see some of the techniques he's using from the standpoint of an author as opposed to just a reader. And then we will be looking at our instructive text, which is a book that I wrote, first draft and second draft. It did not go through as many drafts as the last one I showed you that I had written. But I made a number of changes to this book that are quite drastic, including changes to the point of view, some plot points, some characterization, but also the setting changes. And I wanted to talk about why I made that change and how it affects the story. So I am hoping that you can learn from my mistakes this week. So let's get started, and we will talk first about The Gilded Six Bits by Zora Neale Hurston. As always, you can read this or the Vonnegut story, Harrison Bergeron. I think this week recommend doing both because the settings are so totally different, which is another reason that I chose to put these two stories together. So you can see authors who know what they're doing, really know what they're doing, and giving these details about setting and place and time, but in completely different ways. Their style and the subject matter are really quite different. So The Gilded Six Bits is set in a town called Eatonville, and it was written in the 1920s. It was published in the 1930s, and it seems to be set around the same time it was written, so possibly 1920s to 1930s. But Eatonville was quite a unique town. It's in Orange County in Florida, and part of the Orlando Kissimmee area, so near Disney World. But at the time, it was incorporated in 1887, and it was the first all-black municipality. So it was completely run by African Americans. It was quite different in that sense from any other town or city or village at the time in the United States. So you're talking about 20 years after the Civil War, for a town in the South to be completely run and governed by African Americans would have been quite unusual. And so this is where Zora Neale Hurston is from. And what we're looking at now in this story, we're still in the time of segregation. It's quite a bit before the civil rights movement, but this is an all black town. One of the reasons they wanted to incorporate was because of segregation and Jim Crow laws and all of that they could not get any help or aid for the people of color that were living in this area. So things like police, hospitals, all of that kind of infrastructure was not being provided. And so they were able to fully incorporate separately. So the story starts out, I'm going to read you the first 2 paragraphs. She's using terms that we would not use today, but again, she's African American herself, and it was written and published in 1933. So here is how the story starts. It was a Negro yard around a Negro house in a Negro settlement that looked to the payroll of G&G Fertilizer Works for its support. But there was something happy about the place. The front yard was parted in the middle by a sidewalk from gate to doorstep, a sidewalk edged on either side by quart bottles driven neck down into the ground on a slant, a mess of homey flowers planted without a plan, but blooming cheerily from their helter-skelter places. The fence and house were whitewashed, the porch and steps were scrubbed white. The front door stood open to the sunshine so that the floor of the front room could finish drying after its weekly scouring. So we have this very homey domestic scene. And you have to know, she's writing during the Harlem Renaissance. Certainly, she would have African Americans as her audience, but she's also writing, she's one of the very few for that period of time. There were not that many African American authors who were published and celebrated to the extent that she was. So she's writing this to put a scene in the heads of all of her readers, no matter what their race, to say that this is a happy household at the beginning of the story. And the setting of these are people of color who own this is their yard, this is their house, it's their settlement, it's their town. And so because of that, it really is a story of her people, the people that she grew up with in this town. And we establish that from that first sentence. Now, I think that because this is such a unique place for the time, we have a story that really is a setting, rather, that's really, as I said earlier, intimately connected with these characters and the plot and what occurs in the story. I don't think that you could have this story set in another time and place, right? So we talked before about plot-driven stories and character-driven stories, if you remember from week 2, and I talked about how, you could have a story like The Monkey's Paw. Another good example is A Christmas Carol. The original Christmas Carol is set in Victorian times in Britain, but you have these stories of Scrooge, a person who's visited by 3 ghosts, in many different settings. So you have one with Bill Murray set in New York City. You have one with I saw one version of a woman working in a department store, I think in the late 90s, early 2000s, like a made-for-TV movie. There's one set in the American South. There's many TV shows that kind of take that and have like a Christmas episode. So it's different for this kind of a story. If you look at the language that these people are using, I almost used this story for our dialogue week because they're talking in a dialect that again is very particular to that setting. It's particular to that place and time. So they have things like, Joe, give me some of that potatoes, or I'm trying to read it on the other screen. Sorry. Joe, give me some more of that tater pone. Tater pone being a potato dish that they're eating at the time, right? So gimme is all one word, some mo without the re at the end. And he says, nope, sweetin', that's for us menfolk. So we have this really interesting dialect so that you can feel like you are part of these people's lives and that you're sitting there while they're having this conversation at dinner. So the dialect becomes part of the setting. I talked in my lecture about the social setting of a piece, and certainly that is occurring here too. We have one scene where there are white people looking at this scene of domestic bliss between Joe and his wife, Missy May, and that is about the only time that you have outsiders looking at what is going on. And their interpretation of it is completely incorrect. So it's kind of interesting that she even includes that to show that that people who are white at this time are really looking at the African American community in the wrong way. and misinterpreting what's going on. So that kind of becomes part of the setting as well. But what they do, how they interact, the social kind of rules that are set up. We have an antagonist who comes into this beautiful beautiful household and tries to stir things up. A guy who's kind of a con artist. And the way that he is conning them, again, part of that setting. You could not have the exact con going on today. You might have something else. You could certainly have two people who are young and in love and newly married, and a con artist comes in and tries to trick them. That basic plot point you could have. But the characters themselves really are connected to the time and the place that they're in. The way they talk, the way they think, what they do for work, what they do at home, all of that. So I'd like you to, if you read this story, if you choose this story to read, look for those period details. Look for those details about setting that are quite obvious, like the ones that I read to you at the beginning. And then look for the details about setting that are not as obvious. The dialect, the social structures, the outsiders looking in, how these people in this story are interacting with each other, and then what happens from there. So, Harrison Bergeron. Harrison Bergeron, completely different setting, is a science fiction story. So what we have in the beginning of this is the year was 2081 and everyone was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law, they were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anyone else, no one was better looking than anybody else, nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th amendments to the Constitution and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. So, what's interesting is that we have a paragraph that I just read you of telling instead of showing. If he were to write this as a book, instead of a short story of just about 6 pages, I think we would have a lot more time to watch that process unfold, right? And that might be quite interesting in and of itself if they ever made this into a movie. But the process of adding those amendments, of having a handicapper general, of believing that everyone should be equal in the ways that they're defining equality. So we do have a little bit of telling to kind of say, here's the setup, and then now let's have the story kind of unfold. So it's an interesting bit of exposition where he's using the exposition to establish this setting. The rest of the details of the setting, ostensibly on the outside of it, it seems like this is a story about George and Hazel. They're sitting at their home. They're watching TV. And that's the physical setting, their house. But beyond the borders of their house, there are these things going on in terms of the government. So we have this dystopian setting, what they're watching on TV and how that unfolds as part of the setting, the details that come out very slowly, the way in which George is handicapped, the way in which Hazel is handicapped. There are ballerinas on the screen that are wearing weights, and so they cannot jump and fly and turn, and so you're kind of like, what's the point of having ballerinas then? Well, that's a good question. So then we sort of find out a little bit of detail about Harrison, who is their son, and how he was abnormal, and so now he is in jail. And what I want you to really note here are first, how the exposition is used at the beginning that I read to set things up, how the other details of the setting come out kind of bit by bit, what the rules are for this place, what they are trying to accomplish through these rules, how the people react to the rules, and how science fiction is tied into the setting. So how is the author using possible scientific advancements to show how they could be misused by a government? So what's the government structure? How is that set up? How are these two people interacting within this? What is their home like? How does their home kind of seem normal in some ways and abnormal in other ways? Those are all things that I would like you to look for this week. So you can read one or the other. The Gilded Six Bits, I will say, is the copy that I got for you is possibly a bit difficult to read, so if you can print it out, that might be helpful. Or if you want to keep it on your screen and zoom in, that might be helpful too. But Harrison Bergeron isn't that long of a story. It's 6 pages, but it's quite a large font, so it's probably more like 4 pages. So if you have time to read both, you can. Our creative writing sample on setting: The Misadventures of Marvin Miller. So the first version of this book was set in the 1950s, and it was a book written for adults. So it was really meant to show Marvin's life. I had intended on showing Marvin's life from when he was 6 to when he was about 60. When I had at the time a peer group, a peer writing group where we read and critiqued each other's work, and a few people there suggested that it could be, because there was so much that I had written. I wrote 154 pages of this first draft, which is almost a book in and of itself. But a lot of that was Marvin's childhood and his teenage years. So by the time I got to about a page 140, 150, he still wasn't out of high school. And it really, if I had kept going, I think the book would have been about 500 pages long. But I liked the incidents that occurred, the things that he was doing. The idea basically is that Marvin is kind of a goofy guy. He's trying to do these things to impress girls, but he also just, as many of us do as children, and it might be based on some young men that I knew in my life and things that they did. He acts without thinking. And so he's a little bit foolhardy. He's a little bit reckless. So I had written quite a bit of it, and the people in my group were like, this really seems more like a kid's book, but it's like a kid's book, but it's written in a tone for adults. And I kind of agreed with them. So I decided to change the book to just be Marvin's childhood, a certain portion of Marvin's childhood, focusing on his very early teen years. So it's a book written for tweens about ages, I would say 10 to 14 is typically the age of kid who reads it. And Marvin has just turned 13, and his friends have all gotten girlfriends, and he doesn't have a girl. But the first version is set in the 1950s. The new version is set in contemporary times. I think it was published in 2018, 2019. So the problem with the details of the first version, here's what I did well. I really liked the narration. I liked the point of view. It was quite a bit sarcastic and snarky and things like that. But I did some info dumping in terms of setting that I did not like. It was really kind of awkwardly done. So I'll read you just a bit here. Marvin grew up in a small rural community of Newfane, New York. He was born on August 13th, 1949, the same day the Basketball Association of America merged with the National Basketball League to form the National Basketball Association. The year he was born, the tiny hamlet, situated 40 miles from Buffalo and 5 miles from Lake Ontario, had approximately 5,000 residents. By the time Marvin was in third grade, the population had increased by a whopping 23 individuals. So the issues there, basketball obviously was going to be a large part of the story. That's why that's included. So it's kind of like a little detail about when he was born. That I don't mind. But we don't need to know the exact population. We don't need to know the exact geographical location in terms of how close it is to Buffalo, how close it is to the lake. There's more about how the town, and this is actually true because it's based on a real town, but there's a lot about how the town doesn't have any stoplights, and eventually they get one, and why they have that, and who these 23 residents are. And there are some period details as well, kind of scattered throughout, but they just didn't quite seem to work. It seemed like it was quite a bit forced in there. And because of that, I felt like when I did the new version that the physical setting needed to change. So we have instead a little bit about how this town is small. And here is what Marvin says. He's talking about a mistake he made, but we don't know what it is yet. And here's what he says. It may sound like I'm exaggerating, but what I did was horrifying. And I live in a really, really small town. We've got like 30 farms around here and only one stoplight. And that isn't even a real stoplight. It just blinks outside the fire department. And it only makes cars stop when there's a fire or a parade. So you get from just that little paragraph how small the town is, right? And then he talks a little bit later about how there's only been 12 kids in his class right now. Those are the same 12 kids that have been with him since kindergarten. There's actually 15, but 3 of them are triplets, and he just counts those sometimes as one person because he's, again, a little bit goofy. But the details of the town come along throughout the story much more organically. So that's something to learn in terms of setting. Other things to kind of take a look at, again, by this point, I hope you can see how these literary elements are working together, how the changes to the setting fit the story a little bit better, setting it in contemporary times where kids have cell phones. They, at one point, don't want their parents tracking them, and so they decide to leave their cell phones behind, or they put them in a place where their parents will think that they're playing. We have details about the school, what they're learning, the way that he's on a field trip in the first chapter, what happens there. He ends up having a relationship with a girl who is not the same race as he is, and so some people react to that like, whatever, it's 2018, who cares? And there are some people who are like, I don't care that what year it is, I don't approve of that. And so he kind of has to deal with those things. But I didn't feel like that detail in particular would work in the 1950s and 60s of the original setting and still keep the kind of humorous tone that the book had. It really, at that point, even though we didn't have as much segregation up north, it would have been a kind of a different tone for the book, and it really wouldn't have worked with the rest of the story. So those are the things that I'm hoping that you learn. I hope that you enjoy the 2 stories for this week, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts in the discussion forum. Thanks, everyone.